Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today's story, it totally fits, how I introduced this show. I discuss Brazil from the perspective of race. I've known about singer Vanessa da Mata for a number of years. I think she came out, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or so. She has a handful of albums under her belt, maybe, I don't know, six, seven, eight albums or so. And I've always wondered, whenever you're dealing with Brazil, you always have to wonder how people identify themselves. As you know, for years, most persons of visible African ancestry that you would find in Brazil and they didn't identify themselves as either negro or preto, both terms meaning black. And so, I've always said, people's identity is what they have. I could look at somebody and see them as black, and they don't necessarily see themselves that way. Of course, it's always been said that growing up in the United States versus Brazil is going to be quite a difference in how, race is considered, particularly when you have persons of African ancestry who have lighter skin complexions, right? And I've told this story numerous times. I have, you know, black people across the United States, whether they are brown or darker skin. A lot of us have lighter skinned people in our families, but we just grew up knowing, I always tell the story of how my mother straightened me out because, my mother has fair skin. But from the time I was 8, my mother let me know, like, yeah, she's got fair skin, but she's still black. She still considers herself black. And in the United States, she's always going to be considered black, right? In Brazil, you don't necessarily have it that way. It goes in the opposite direction. People are taught to, just define yourself as anything but black, right? So I can honestly say, if you go back 20, 25 years, a lot of people who identify themselves as black in Brazil today, they probably would not have back in, say, the 90s and before that. And even in the first, I don't know, 5 to 10 years of the 21st century, it just wasn't very common. And to tell you the truth, it's still not very common because when you look at how Brazil defines, color classification, to this day, people who define themselves as distinctly and only black or preta, I think it's about 8% today. Whereas you have this category known as pardo, which means brown or mixed. And that category is probably about, I want to say about 47, 48% now, because the two put together equals 56% of the Brazilian population now. And whereas, when I first started studying Brazil, I just kind of accepted that all pretos and pardos, blacks and browns were considered black in Brazil. But as I've had to say this repeatedly, that I've had to change my view on that after having lived in Brazil for a number of years and coming across so many people that honestly, you just can't classify them by just one race. Now, granted, there are a number of people in this Pardo category who, by all intents and purposes, would be considered black. But you can't, I would never consider all Pardos in Brazil as being black. And I can just honestly say, we just don't really know how many black people there are in Brazil. It depends on, how people see themselves, how the world sees them. You'll have one person who some people say, nah, 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 that's a white girl, or no, 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 that's a black. That's a black girl with light skin. Then you got other people just say, just leave them in the middle. You can't classify them. So for me, and I have to make this clear all the time, I count for me, people who in Brazil are considered black are people, regardless of whether they're fair skin, brown skin, or black skin. If you could look at them and not have to guess, then that person should be classified as black. That's how I see it. Those people who you have to get 5 or 10 other opinions and you have to debate it, those people probably shouldn't be considered black. But even within that black category, if I accept certain lighter skinned people as black, there's still going to be some people who say, no, that person is not black. So I'm comfortable just saying, there's a sizable black population in Brazil. We'll probably just never know any exact numbers. But what's intriguing now is that you do have people, as I started saying, at the beginning of this video, people who just 25 years ago probably would not have considered themselves black. Today, they are adapting a black identity, right? So singer Vanessa da Mata is a really good example of this. So today's story is called I'm Black. Don't take away the one thing I know about myself. Singer Vanessa da Mata stirs up debate on race and color in Brazil. And this debate is going to keep going on, but this particular piece comes from an interview from I think it's like a talk show setting on the GNT. It's a Brazilian television network. And it wasn't with just Vanessa da Mata. There was another singer on there named Larissa Luz. One of the women on the panel, sitting on the couch having a conversation, was actually a woman named Bella Gil. Bella Gil is one of the daughters of the popular musician Gilberto Gil. He's one of the most, well-known Brazilian singers within the country and outside of the country. Gilberto Gil should be about 81 years old by now. And I'm going to take what Vanessa da Mata talked about in her interview and then juxtapose it against something that another of Gilberto Gil's daughters, Preta Gil, said in an interview that you can find on YouTube. I mean, both of these clips you can actually find on YouTube, but I just find it intriguing because what both of these women said, both of these women being of so-called mixed race, having a black parent and a white parent, it's intriguing what Vanessa da Mata is saying today versus what Preta Gil, how she saw herself just growing up. I think Preta Gil was born in 1974. Vanessa da Mata was born in 1976. So both of them somewhere in the mid 1970s. And let's just contrast what they say, because what both of them are representing something that I just said. 25, 30, and 40 and 50 years ago, people who look like them most likely, you did have some fair-skinned people who identified as black in the 50s and 60s, but for the most part, most Brazilians who look like them 25 to 30 years ago and further back than that would never have identified themselves as black. So it speaks volumes of where the racial discussion is in Brazil and where it's been, particularly over the last 15 years. So let's get into this. It's a discussion I never get tired of having. This is one of the reasons I started this blog in the first place. So Vanessa da Mata, in a section of the interview she did on this GNT talk show, she says, but I was gonna say, listen, don't take away the only thing I know about myself, that I'm black. Don't take away the only thing I know about myself, because it's all very confusing, isn't it? Now, keep in mind, I have to keep I couldn't just take the whole video itself because, global TV in Brazil will strike this in a minute. So, I'm just using some still images of Vanessa da Mata from that show. And then someone asked, but that only happened to you as an adult? She says, I used to say at home, people, we are black, for God's sake. Then people would look at me. Yeah? People are black, looking at us. Anywhere you go in the world, we're black. Go to Germany, go to the United States. There's no way to deny we're black. So it went on and people became more conscious, but very slowly. A lot of good things that she pointed out in this particular point, where she's saying that people in Brazil, it took a while for a lot of people to come into a black identity. It took a lot of campaigns from Brazil's black movement called the Movimento Negro. It took a lot of well-known people coming out and defining themselves as black for this identity process that a lot of people are still going through today. This is something that I've covered on a number of years, on the blog, this whole search for black identity. This particular journalist, I'm forgetting her name right now. What is her name? Yeah, I can't remember her name, but she's a journalist on the CNN Brazil edition. And she said that traditional media massacres our black identity. And yeah, that's true. It's like you look in Brazil's media and everywhere that you go, it's it's a way of destroying people, developing a black identity. It's like everything that they would show on television, the images of black people would be so negative that, nobody would want to identify as black. And this is what she's talking about. I know this lady's name. I've talked about her before. I just can't remember what her name is right now. Being a black woman, being a woman and black is beautiful. African Revolution in Brazil, an interview with Gabi Oliveira, a popular YouTuber, on the rise of Black identity and consciousness, the development of Black identity in a country that encourages one not to be Black. So these are all stories that there are numerous stories in the blog where I'm talking about this development of Black identity in a country that it just didn't want people to identify themselves as Black. Here's a story. The well-known soccer player Neymar, people have clowned him for years because when he first came out, he denied he was Black. But so I've always asked the question, did he really deny he was Black? Because he said, "Eu não sou preta." "Eu não sou preta," which means I am not Black. But as we'll get into this discussion a little bit more, some people see a difference between the term preto and the term negro, both meaning Black. Some people just look at the term preto as meaning persons, Black people who are darker skinned. And Neymar is not dark skinned. He's not. I mean, if you compare him to maybe a white person, you could consider him darker. But if he's looking at it as in a sense of color versus race, then maybe he could get away with saying he's not Black. "Eu não sou preto," but he is negro. He is Black, being part of the Black race. For years, he didn't speak on this until some racist incidents that a lot of people who watch global soccer, about this story that happened in a soccer stadium in Europe, and where Neymar felt like he was the victim of a racist comment on the soccer field. And so, everybody has something to say about this. This guy wrote an open letter to Neymar about becoming Black, because up until that point, he had always denied himself. He had always denied being Black. He's just Brazilian. I just play soccer. This piece from 2021. After long historical discussions, pardos, meaning brown or people of mixed race, gain a new identity, light-skinned Blacks. What else do we have here? Liliane constructed her identity as a Black woman through studies. So, coming into Blackness in Brazil is something that's been ongoing. So that's why it's such a big deal when people talk about racial classification and identity in Brazil today. It's really different than it was, say, like I said, when I first started studying Brazil back in the year 2000 or so. So now let's get into what Preta Gil had to say. Now, again, Preta Gil is the one of the many. I think Gilberto Gil has about 8 kids, and I think Preta Gil was born in 1974, if I'm not mistaken. So she would be about 49 by now. So then she appeared on a talk show on YouTube, and she says she's talking about her story. She says, "Then I went to tell a story about my life, and I said, I that am a typical mulata." That was in 2017. This is what she's saying. She's going back to this appearance she made, I guess, on at some type of lecture in 2017. She says, "I, who am a typical Brazilian mulata, got a ooh from the back of the theater," which was for me. I looked at the other person and I said, "What's going on?" And I hadn't even understood that it was booing. So what she's saying here is that she was speaking at some event in Salvador in the northeast of the country. Now, mind you, Salvador is considered one of the blackest states in the country. It's considered the African center of Brazil. So, you know how Brazil works. Brazil is such an enormous country. It's like the size of continental United States. So you can easily go from being a Black person in the south of Brazil, where it's more European looking people, versus the north and the northeast that are, primarily people of color. So she's speaking about this in Salvador Bahia, and she's defining herself as a mulata, right? So then she says, Rita said to me, whoever Rita is, I have to watch the whole interview to understand who Rita is, but she says, she's telling Preta Gil, she says, "You said you were mulata." I said, "Of course. I'm mulata. That's how I learned it at school. That's how I learned it in the books. That's how my family brought me up. I'm a mulata. I'm a mixture of a white mother and a Black father. I'm mulata." So listen to what Preta Gil is saying. She's saying she was educated, obviously in the 70s and 80s, And growing up, she was always taught that she was mulata. She's a mix of a black person with a white person. So this reiterates what I'm saying is that you go back to the 70s and 80s, and most people were busy trying to avoid being defined as black. That's the way you were raised. Okay. The other thing I want to mention here, I want to go back to something Vanessa da Mata said during her part of her interview, where she says, look, anywhere you go in the world, we're black. Go to Germany, go to the United States. What I find intriguing about that statement is that Brazil has always tried to separate itself from the rest of the world in terms of racial classification. So you have a lot of stories of Brazilians who, for all their lives, they considered themselves not to be black. Then they go to the United States and people automatically look at them like, you can call yourself what you want, but over here, you're going to be black. So the question is always, uh, is it possible for Brazil to separate itself from the rest of the world? And we know that this does happen. If there's certain, you go to Africa and certain, a lot of light skinned people won't be seen as black. Obviously Africa being a continent where most of the people are black, it took years for Africa to even have a concept of being black because they were Africans. This whole race thing is something that is invented in the West. So can Brazil, we're in the West, we're in the Americas. Can Brazil honestly say that these type of people are not black, but yet you go to certain countries in the world and they see those same people as black? Does that kind of undermine black identity? I would argue that it did for many years. And people are starting to get this certain consciousness that says, okay, yeah, I may not be dark skinned black. I might be a mixture of a black and a white person and some indigenous ancestry, but people see me as black in general. There's just numerous stories of even famous black Brazilians who have come to accept this black identity. So when Vanessa da Mata said this, it once again it stirred up this debate about not only who should be considered black, but also the usage of the term preto and negro. Which term is sufficient? Which term should apply when they both mean black? So the Mundo Negro website did a piece on it. I think this is back from May. I've been wanting to cover this story for a while, but finally got around to it tonight. So the name of the article from Mundo Negro says, Black or Brown, Vanessa da Mata's comments generates debate about correct classification in the black racial group. This is written by someone named Isadora Santos. And again, it's taken from the Mundo Negro website. So during her appearance on the show Saia Justa on GNT, singer Vanessa da Mata said that it took her a while to recognize herself as a black woman. She says, even with my big hair and talking about my features and defending black hair, it took me a long time. And at that time, it was a bit of a fad to say, you're not, meaning you're not black. And I said, don't take away the only thing I know about myself, that I'm black, she said. The singer's comment sparked a debate about the importance of correctly classifying color within the black racial group and how misidentification harms social indicators and the assertive application of public policies. During the chat, another singer, popular singer, Larissa Luz, Astrid Fontinelli, Gabriela Prioli, and Bella Gil, popular chef. And again, she's actually Preta Gil's sister and another of Gilberto Gil's daughters. The chef said that it took her a while to understand her racial identity, saying, it took me a while to understand that I was a black woman, let alone have an anti-racist education, vision, and attitude, said Bella Gil. In response, Vanessa da Mata said that it took her a while to understand herself in this way. Even with my big hair and talking about my features and defending my black hair, it took me a long time. Now, she's saying defending her black hair because, having what's called cabelo crespo or kinky curly hair in Brazil is another point of which people are humiliated by the racist comments that people just will make. It's accepted in Brazil that straighter hair is beautiful hair, whereas kinky curly hair is considered ugly. She says, because I had a white father with light eyes who I looked at and said, well, what about him? It was as if I was sending him away and I was only my mother's daughter. And at that time, it was something of a fad to say, you're not. And I said, don't take away from me the only thing I know about myself, that I'm black. I think she's exaggerating a little bit. I mean, realistically, I think she knows a lot more about herself than she's just black, because it's all very confusing. I used to say at home, guys, we're black for God's sake, she said. This is Carla Acotirini, Tereni, I think. And she has a pretty large following on social media. She's involved in academia, and she does a lot of talk about race. She's talked about interracial relationships and black identity, the position of black women in Brazilian society. She's done a lot of academic works, and people, a lot of people look to her for just she sets an example for where the heads and the minds and the souls of black Brazilians are these days. In the comments, Carla Acatirini, a PhD in gender studies, women and feminisms at the Federal University of Bahia, pointed out the need to understand a racial classification of preta and parda, meaning black and brown, and how the confusion caused by misunderstanding can harm social indicators. This is what she says. My sisters, look, you are negras, black women, and not pretas, black women. Preta is a subgroup of color that has not suffered miscegenation within the race. Unfortunately, we need to reformulate these statements as they are detrimental to social indicators in the collection of the color category in public facilities. An affectionate kiss to all. She said, if we were to collect color, you would be pardas negras. I, Carla, am a preta negra, she explained. So let's break this down, what she's talking about. She's trying to make a distinction between people. The confusion comes in when there are people who prefer to use the term preto as black versus negro, meaning black. Whereas for the movimento negro, the argument has always been that preto falls under the negro category because they say that preto, meaning black, and pardo, meaning brown, are both part of the category negro, which encompasses both sides and is supposed to represent Brazil's black population. So what she's saying is that people who fall under the negro category, whether they're pardo or preto, they're both part of that group. And she's just saying her as a darker skinned woman, she's considered a preta negra, a dark skinned black woman, versus people like Vanessa da Mata, who they might say is a parda negra. Hope this isn't something that's too confusing. Because a lot of people are rejecting the term negro now in Brazil. I'm seeing more and more people who prefer to use the term preta to categorize the entire umbrella of people who fall under the black race category, right? So what she's arguing here is that they need to have these categories straight, because when there are things such as quotas and affirmative action that's being set aside to promote racial equality, they need a fairly accurate number of people who are considered black and brown in the country. So that's what she's talking about here. I'm going to say that I've come to my own view now, and I just believe that people who are you can't just racially define it under one group. Those people really should be defined as pardos. I'm just saying, after all the promotion of black identity that's been going on in Brazil for the last 40 to 45 to 50 years, people who are under the Pardo category who see themselves as black, they should leave that Pardo category and come over to the Preto category and let those racially indefinable people continue to use the term Pardo. And that way, I think we'll get a more accurate count of how many black people there are in Brazil. So I kind of disagree with what she's saying. We can't. She argued in one of her Instagram posts, like, give us back the term Pardo. Pardo should be part of the black category. And like I said, I agree to a certain degree. I just know that all pardos should not be considered black. And we've seen many contradictions in that philosophy come out when they reject certain lighter skinned persons who are pardos and saying, you're not black enough to get quotas. And so I've always said, you can't use these people to inflate the numbers of the black population, but then dismiss them when it's time to get quotas or something like that. So I differ with her a little bit on that point. Sociologist Sarah Araújo recently published a post on her social networks explaining that people in Brazil confuse the terms. She said that there is a stark difference between being a preta and a negra, right? Again, both meaning black. She says preta, meaning black, is a skin tone. There is a percentage of around 13% of pessoas pretas, or black people in Brazil, or darker skinned black people in Brazil, who are made invisible. To give you an idea, this percentage is basically the total percentage of Black people in the United States. So there is a large percentage of Black people who live in the invisibility of public policies. So here's a statistic that kind of breaks down what I'm talking about here. The proportion in the population according to the IBGE. When you combine Pretos and Pardos in Brazil in 2012, it was 53% when they were already moving to say Brazil is a majority Black country by mixing Pretos and Pardos and calling them all Black. In 2021, that number went up to 56%, whereas we've seen the drop in people who identify as white or brancos. In 2012, it was 46.3%, and in 2021, it was 43%. So we saw the white category lose about 3.3%. Now, some of those people, it's intriguing what's going on in Brazil because you've had some Pardos move into the Preto category, and then you've seen some white people move into the Pardo category, and even in some cases, they move into the Black category. It'll take you a while to understand how Brazil works in that way. It's not as cut and dry as you find in the United States. So, what does the IBGE say? The Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, or the IBGE, adopts a special classification for Black people, dividing them into two categories. Those two categories are Preto and Pardo, which mean Black and brown. This classification is used in the research and population surveys carried out by the IBGE, including the demographic census. The separation into Blacks and Browns is intended to capture the racial diversity that exists in the Brazilian population, taking into account different skin tones and ethnic origins. According to the criteria adopted by the IBGE, people who declare themselves Black are those who have Black skin with phenotypical traits of African descendants. Brown people, on the other hand, are those characterized by a mixture of racial characteristics such as Black, white, and indigenous. Now, one thing I want to point out here, somebody said this in the piece above, where they were saying that, Pretos, I think it was, Carlo Accocherini, where she says that, where is that in here? She says something to the degree of Preta is a subgroup of color that has not suffered miscegenation within the race. That's not true. You go to Brazil and you can find very dark-skinned people, but you can still look at them and say that they're mixed. Something, will tell you, like, whether it's their facial features or you'll see jet black people with straight hair or a loose curl of hair. And it's like, it's a well-known fact that everybody in Brazil is mixed. Some come out more clearly Black. Some of them come out more clearly white. Some of them end up in the middle. Some people look just white with a little bit of mixture going on. So I disagree with that point too. I don't believe all DNA tests, but I've seen enough. The DNA test that studied Brazil some years ago basically said even the darker skinned Black people in Brazil have a mixed race background. So I don't know why she would say something like that. That Preta is a subgroup of color that has not suffered miscegenation within the race. No, I totally disagree with that. I mean, having dark skin does not necessarily mean that you didn't have any non-African ancestry in the 400 or 500 years that Brazil's had African people in the country. Okay. Let's see, this differentiation between Blacks and Browns, again, Pretos and Pardos, is relevant to the analysis and understanding of racial inequalities in the country, as it allows the Black population to be identified and quantified more precisely. So anyway, this is another story I wanted to talk about, this question of race and color in Brazil and this shift that's moving a lot of persons into the Black category, right? You have two women here who are basically born around the same time, one in 74, one in 76. They both have a Black parent and a white parent. And one of them points out, look, when I grew up, I identified as mulatto because that's what I was taught. Years later, Preta Gil is doing this speech in Salvador, Bahia, and she hears boos in the audience when she defines herself as a mulatta. So from her growing up and defining herself and being accepted as mulatta to, the 21st century, people will call you out if they see you as Black, but you continue to use terms that the Black population is now rejecting, the mulatta and the morena and all of these terms that are mean. A lot of people see that as a way to deflect away from defining oneself as Black. So just in the lifetime of these two singers, similar backgrounds in terms of their racial ethnicity, And it just shows where the race question has gone, particularly, like I said, in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a pretty broad change going on in Brazil in terms of how people classify themselves. So I'm curious to know, when I look at Vanessa da Mata, you see her how you see her, but looking at her features, this looks like a black woman with just fair skin. She, you look at her mouth, her face, the texture of her hair. To me, that's a light skinned black woman. I mean, maybe you're free to see her. People can argue what they will. Vanessa da Mata herself defines herself as not only negra, she defines herself as Preta. She even put out a song in the early part of her career that was called Il So Neguinha. It's like, am I black? Now, her doing this song took on a different meaning because it wasn't, she covered this song. This song is actually by another popular, world renowned Brazilian musician, Caetano Veloso. I think he released this song in 1987, and Vanessa da Mata covered it. And it just took on a new meaning because it's almost like, are you speaking on yourself? Because you're asking a question, am I black? So I'm curious to know what you all think about this. How do you see Preta Gil, and how do you see Vanessa da Mata? Do you look at her as, okay, this is a light skinned black woman? Do you see her as just mixed? Do you see her as white? Do you like she doesn't belong in the black category? Just curious to know what you think. Drop a comment in the comment section. Let's start a conversation about this. This ongoing conversation about race and class, race and color classification in Brazil. Consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. If you've seen more than a few videos that interest you, like this video, share this video, click on the notification bell so you'll get, notification of when I put new videos up. And with that said, I'm going to end the video here and ask you to come back and check out the next video when I post it.